to my channel where we question everything. Today's topic is military affairs and the contentious subject of the Kherson Withdrawal. Now, I know a lot of people wouldn't agree with me about that the Kherson Withdrawal by the Russian forces was a strategic blunder and it shouldn't have happened. And then I was also accused that I have no military credentials and that I could not make any decisions. And okay, I don't want to do this, but I have a dispute with the Saker, the Andrei of the Saker. And whatever I said to him, he took it personally, because I said the pro-Russian people are making up excuses for the withdrawal and not seeing the facts on the ground. And unfortunately, he behaved after that a little bit childish, but that's his problem, not mine. As I've said in the previous videos, apparently he has a master's degree in strategy, but again, I will also say it doesn't mean much for me. I don't put a lot of value in credentials. I put a value on how you argue and how logical your argument is, and if it makes sense, and if you have thought wide enough, and if there are not other counter-arguments. And that is what I look at. But in any case, I don't want to really go into that. The point that I'm trying to make is that, well, I went and looked and Googled, and I think the reason why the Russian forces withdrew out of Kherson was a threat of an attack on the reservoir, which could flood the area and basically then cut off the Russian troops. And a lot of civilian people would drown and be damaged, and that was a risk that the Russians were not prepared to do. And I believe, and I stand on the correction, that the reason why the pro-Russian commentators defended that decision, because from a strategic point of view, it made a lot of sense. And I believe, or I guess if you want to call it, that they tried to basically say that Russia doesn't find about territory, and that they try to implement the concept defense in depth. I think that is the military strategic principle they would have liked to apply to the Kherson Withdrawal. And one has to now look at what is a defense in depth principle, strategy. And you can easily Google up. Wikipedia has a nice article about that. You know, Wikipedia is not a good source of research if you want to, but of course a lot of information is biased, but on articles like this, the bias is very little. It is a military strategic principle, and why would any contributor really lie about that? When we talk about events, history, and politics, and I can understand that, but not other things. So whatever is written in the defense of that article on Wikipedia, it's quite authentic or credible. Well, the point here is that the forces will have a defensive line, which is not that well protected. I don't know why you would not protect the defensive line properly. But it seems to me that, say, it is weakly defended, and then they experience an attack from the enemy, frontal attack or whatever. And then say, let's call the Russians as the defenders, what they will then do is they will withdraw back to a pre-prepared defensive position that is much stronger to be able to defend. Now, if I come back to the original one, it will probably be from terrain base, that it might not be that good to defend the initial position, but from a terrain based, the second fallback defensive lines would be a much better option. And that will basically lure the enemy into a pre-planned, pre-assigned artillery fire command or instruction or plan. So once the enemy enters and follows them, they go into a kill zone, and then with a massive barrage of artillery, they can eliminate the enemy and so forth. And if they hit the second defensive line, which is much better as a defensive line, they could repel the attack. And this is all military, 100%, no problem. But then we have to come back to reality. So we look at the SMO, and I did a video about the progress of the Russian SMO over the 9 months or 10 months. 9 months? 9 months. Any case. And unfortunately, you cannot see the Kherson withdrawal in its isolation. If you looked at the initial offense, which people call the counter-offense, in the Lyman area, Isium. Which one is first? I might get confused. Well, the first offense was Isium. It was Isium. Yeah, it was Isium. So what the Russians were, they were poorly defended or poorly spaced around that part of the front line. And way that I understood is they had withdrawn a lot of their forces in order to strengthen their forces in the Kherson area, the defensive line, because most of the offensive or attacks of the Ukrainian forces was in the Kherson area, and each one of them were repelled. So the bulk of the Russian forces were in Kherson station, and that is why in Isium they were lowly defended. And the Ukrainians amassed a certain force, about, I think, 9,000 men, and they attacked on the weakly defended position of the Russians, and then the Russians withdrew. And then the question was asked, were the Russians moving into the pre-prepared defensive positions? And according to what I can understand and the information I get, these pre-prepared defensive positions were not available. So there was no pre-prepared defensive line, second defense line, as the principle of the defense in depth. And that is why, in my opinion, why it was a failure of the Russian withdrawal from Isium. And then they stopped and they defended, and they moved even further back behind the river. I can't remember what the river's name was. So yeah, that becomes a better defensive position. But that was not the planned defensive position. It was a little bit more to the west, which the Ukrainians also forced them to withdraw from. So the principle of the defense in depth was not applied in that region of the initial counteroffensive. They did it ad hoc basis in terms of the retreating troops because they had the skills, maybe, or they had the inclination to do that. So they did cause some casualties on the attacking Ukrainian forces, but, you know, excessive casualties is a relative principle, and if you kill 100 men of 9,000 men, then that is not an excessive or huge losses. Those are all within the parameters of an offense, percentage-wise. So the Ukrainians won the battle in the Isium. You cannot ignore it, and you cannot make excuses for that. But all Russian, pro-Russian commentators made excuses and said it means nothing on the field. But the principle of defense in depth wasn't applied, so it was a failure on the Russians' withdrawal. They withdraw to a more safe position twice. And that's what, but I was also pro-Russian, and I also made excuses of that, make no mistake. And but I believe I later on saw my error. And then we had the Lyman attack. Again, go read the article over defense in depth and what is the problems. So let me read you what the disadvantage is of the defense in depth. The disadvantages of a defense in depth are that it may be unacceptable for a defendant to plan to give ground to an attacker. That should have been applied to Kherson. This may be because vital military or economic resources are close to the front line, or because yielding to an enemy is unacceptable for political or cultural reasons. Kherson. In addition, the continuous retreats that are required by defense in depth require the defender to have a high degree of mobility in order to retreat successfully, and they assume, and this is important, that the defender's morale will recover from the retreat. See the implication? Defense in depth is not an all-catch-all type of strategy. It has disadvantages. Morale, which is a big problem, and it was strategic, and the Russians shouldn't have let go of Kherson. There were other options available. But in any case, coming back to the Lyman offensive, it's again, it was a retreat, by retreat, and a retreat, and a retreat, until they said that the logistical lines of the Ukrainian forces were so large, and the force was so dispersed, that another attack wouldn't have made it. So if they stalled and allowed the logistics to catch up, and if they had reserves that they could have followed in and followed all the, strengthened the basically Ukrainian front soldiers, then another attack would have happened, and then Russia might have retreated a little bit more. But again, in my opinion, the depth of defense of depth principle hasn't been applied. And then we had the Kherson retreat. Now, like I said, the Kherson retreat in isolation, I can understand that, but still it's not a good thing, especially for the morale, and because the Russians sitting now, and it is difficult to recross the Ukrainians and the Russians now, the river, to get onto the bridgehead onto the eastern side of the river. And you know, no, I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. But even now, considering the Isium withdrawal and the Lyman withdrawal, which both were not a strategy of the defense in depth, so the Kherson, in my opinion, withdrawal was a strategic, an operational, and a tactical error. And that is why I disagree with Andre. But he's only looking in isolation at Kherson itself, and if you look in isolation, you could have agreed. But if I was a commander, I wouldn't have retreated. I would have looked for different options. All the reservists that were called up, the first ones would have entered the Kherson area. I would have strengthened that force. I would have, say, carbon bombing the Ukrainian positions. I would have swarmed the air with UIVs for spotting the enemy, in infrared, whatever I had available. I would have amassed my counter-battery system there, my electronic warfare, because they already done it. Because that is why the Isium front was so sparsely populated. And I would have defended my logistical lines over the River Pontoon by air defenses significantly. I wouldn't have put one machine there. I would have done 10 machines there and protected my logisticals and Kherson City. And I would have driven those guys back to a point, which I have to do in any case. It's not that I don't do it. I have to do it in future. Might as well do it then. And that is why I say, pro-Russian commentators should stop making excuses and give credit where credit is due. And the Ukrainians are not defeated. And they haven't spent all of their forces. And they haven't spent all of their equipment. And they are being resupplied. And the Ukrainians are just as clever as the Russian counterparts. That is how it works. As much as you want to demonize the Ukrainians, they are human beings just like you, think like you, and as I said, What is obvious to you is obvious for them as well. If you can see them, they can see you. If you can see their weaknesses, they can see their own weaknesses, and vice versa. And this story about heavy losses, somebody should somewhere start to define it. Because this is a constant narrative that is wrong. It's undefined, unqualified, unquantified. And effectively, it means nothing. In any case, that's my story for today. If you don't agree, I can understand that. I will respect your opinion. So, if you want to subscribe, subscribe. Don't want to, too bad. If you want, tell your friends, spread the word. And until next time, cheers.